Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. Well, I'm in Georgia, but we had a snowstorm, and we didn't have any bread. So I decided to make some sandwich bread by a new recipe that I'd been working on, and it turned out fabulous. So I decided to share it with you. Hope you enjoy it. Here is a list of ingredients, and you can pause to write them down. And hey, while you're paused, give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Then you can get notices of new videos when I post them about twice a week. Now let's get baking. So our recipe starts with 1 cup of whole milk, and I'm going to scald it. And since folks are often asking me what is scalding of milk, I thought I'd show you. So scalding basically means that you heat the milk up until just before it boils. So it was cold. This will only take a couple minutes, and I'm going to heat it just until we see the first bubbles, and it kind of starts to bubble up the side like that. Now, the reason that we scald milk before we use it in bread is because it denatures some of the proteins and kills the enzymes, which makes for better bread. Now, I'm going to pour this hot milk over cold butter. That's 3 tablespoons of butter that I chopped up. And that's going to, number 1, cool the milk down a little bit. Number 2, melt the butter. And I want to talk to you just a little bit about yeast. You can use active dry yeast, or you can use this instant yeast. I use SAF Instant Red, and you can also use Gold. But red is more all-purpose. And you don't have to proof this yeast. I buy it in the big containers and keep it in the freezer. But I'm going to show you how to proof it anyway. So we've got the milk and butter, and this is 1 tablespoonful of yeast. You could use 1 packet of the active dry you buy at the grocery store. I just don't find that yeast to be reliable. Just my personal preference. And I have here a tablespoonful of sugar. Now, folks will tell you have to add sugar to feed the yeast, and it does proof faster if you add sugar, but you really don't have to add sugar to bread. It will rise without sugar. It just may take a little longer. So I'm going to stir that up, and I'm going to let this sit here for about 5 minutes just to prove that the yeast is active. And I'm doing it with my instant yeast, even though you don't have to, because it's actually been in the freezer for almost a year. And after 5 minutes, you can see the bubbly froth, and that means it's just fine. We can go forward with our recipe. Again, you don't have to do this with instant yeast. I just wanted to show you how, in case you were using active dry. Then this recipe calls for 3 cups of all-purpose flour. I buy unbleached. I buy King Arthur. You can buy anything. And this is the way you do it. You fluff it up, and then you scoop it into your measuring cup, and then fluff it just a little. Make sure it's filled in, and smooth it off with something flat. I'm going to measure 3 cups this way and put it in my bowl. Now you could mix and knead this by hand. I'm going to use my mixer, and I'm adding 1.5 teaspoons full of salt, and then I'm going to add a tablespoonful of Splenda. You'll see in the ingredients, I say you could use 2 tablespoons full of sugar, or 1 sugar, 1 Splenda. It may seem silly to skimp on the sugar when there's this many carbs in a dish, but I do cut back sugar every time I can. Then I'm going to add my dough hook, and I'm going to let this mix on speed 2 on the KitchenAid, a low speed on whatever mixer you're using, until it all comes together and pulls away cleanly from the side of the bowl. You may have to add a little more, or even a tablespoonful of water, depending on the texture, but I didn't have to add anything else the 2 times I've made this recipe. It's pulled away cleanly. You can see that. Now I'm going to, let me focus again. Show you this. It's pulled clean, and I'm going to set this on knead on 4, speed 4, and let it knead for 7 minutes. And when that's done, I'll be back. So here we go. It's been 7 minutes. Now, how do I know that it's kneaded just the right amount? I'm going to show you. If you've watched my other videos, I've shown you this before. But if you're new to bread making or new to my videos, I'll show you. We're going to do the window pane test. Pinch off a piece. Oil your hands a little if you need to. And I'm sorry I keep coming out of the frame here because I can't look through the viewfinder and work. But I'll pull it back and let you see. You want to get it between your fingers and slowly stretch it out. And if it stretches out until there are spots where you can see the light through it, then it has kneaded enough. And I know it's difficult, but I can see the little thin spots where you can pull the bread dough very thin, enough for light to shine through without it tearing. That's the window pane test. If it won't do that, knead it another minute. This one is kneaded enough. This is a good elastic dough, and we're going to take it out now. So I'm going to get my proofing bowl ready. This is just a plastic bowl. You can use any bowl that's big enough. This one's big enough for 2 loaves, and I always use it for proofing. A little oil on the bottom and up the sides, and then I'll take the lid and I'll oil that too. This single loaf won't rise high enough to touch the bottom of the lid, but I oil it just in case. So I'm going to form this into a ball. You don't have to put it down on the counter. You can. Just form it into a ball and pinch it off at the bottom. We're going to let this sit in our proofing bowl and rise in a warm spot for about an hour or until the loaf has doubled in size. And I'll show you how to test it to make sure that it's proofed correctly. And depending on your kitchen, it could be 45 minutes to an hour and a half. And I think probably about 50 minutes is going to work for me. I'll check back. I'll set the timer. While the bread's proofing, I want to talk to you a little bit about my cast iron bread pans. I have 3. I'm going to show you 2 of them here. This is a Camp Chef, and this is a Lodge. The Lodge is a little bit smaller. It's actually not quite big enough for a standard loaf of bread for most recipes. If you'll see, it fits all the way down into the Camp Chef. And it's a little heavier. And I do like to buy from American companies, and Camp Chef is not. But it's just not quite big enough. So I went ahead and got the Camp Chef, and I really like it. They come pre-seasoned, and when you use cast iron to cook your bread, you get a nice color all the way around. So it's been 50 minutes, and as I said, in your kitchen, it could take an hour, it could take more. This is how you check it. See, I've already checked it once. See that little hole? Poke your finger in just a little bit. And if it's not ready, the dough will swoosh back in and fill up the spot. If it doesn't start to fill in at all, it could be overproofed. This one is slowly filling in. And so it's ready. And before I punch it down, I'm going to go ahead and oil my pan. If I had a butter wrapper, I would just wipe it with the butter wrapper. Somebody in the group, Mark Lynch, said he uses bacon fat on his because it gives it a little bacony flavor. This was olive oil. And now I'm going to punch this bread down. So why do we punch it down? We want to let some of that air release. While it was proofing, it was forming carbon dioxide and gluten strands. We want to let some of the carbon dioxide out, punch it down and make it kind of flat, and then I'm going to do a little rolling and shaping. Now this is sandwich bread. Let me put just a little bit of flour on here. That may have been actually just a little bit too much, but I'll spread it out. You want to make a kind of a grain in your sandwich bread. You want it to kind of be swirled inside, and that helps the texture. And I'm going to fold this like a letter fold to start with, and push it to try to make it all stick together. This is a very firm dough. Not all bread you make is this firm. Sometimes it's pretty loose, but this really stands up. to the rolling pin. And if you're having trouble rolling it, you can always just let it rest 5 minutes. This is an elastic dough. It springs back. But if you let it rest about 5 minutes, it will relax a little. And I'm just going to roll it out on both sides and brush the excess flour off. And I'll just let you watch this just a little bit. I'm not going to make you watch it all, but just so that you get an idea of the texture of this dough. And when you're rolling, you don't go quite all the way to the end. You'll make it a little thinner on the end. So just roll it right up to the edge. And then I'm going to do another fold here. And I'm only doing that to get the texture inside the bread into a sort of a swirl. So now I'm going to roll it out, and I want to make it as wide as my pan. And I'm going to hit it a little bit there on the end just to get rid of my fold marks. Because, you know, it could just sort of unfold if you don't roll it all together. Now I'm going to widen it out a little bit, trying to get it about the same width as my pan. I'll flip it back and forth. And there's my measuring device. I've got my pan there. And I'm going to fold those rough ends over just a little bit in just a second, just to sort of make a rectangle. And I'm giving it a good bit of pressure. This is a really firm dough. And no, not all bread is like this. When you start to roll it out, it may not be this firm. See, I'm just going to fold that there so that I have kind of uniform ends. And roll it to make sure that it's combined back in. See, it's very smooth. This is what will be the outside, and that's very smooth. And we've got some little air bubbles coming up because you know that yeast in there is still very, very active. So just if you have the little bubbles, just poke them out. Because if you don't poke them out, then there's going to be gaps in your bread, the texture. And this is sandwich bread. We don't want that. So poke them out. Then I'm going to just roll this tightly into a loaf. And then I'll pinch the sides to smooth them out. And then I'm going to pinch the seam. Because as I said, it is possible for it to unroll while it's cooking. We don't want that. So we're going to pinch that together all the way around and make sure that any rough spots are on the bottom. There you go. Pull it up a little tight. I think that's about right. Now I'm just going to flip this over into the pre-greased loaf pan. And it fits just right. Now we're going to put a cover on this and let it rise again. And I've got a piece of plastic wrap here. I'm going to put a little oil on that because I don't want it to stick to the bread. Some people use a floured lint-free towel. I don't, because if it sticks at all, when you start to pull it off, it can deflate your loaf. So I just use a little plastic wrap here. Now we're going to put this back in that same warm spot and let it rise about 45 minutes to an hour until the bread starts to crown. And I'll show you what that means when we get to that point. So it's been 45 minutes and the bread is crowning. It means the crown of the bread has come up over the edge of the pan. And I'll do the same test again, a very gentle poke. And it doesn't rush right back in. This bread is ready to cook. Preheated 350 degree oven for 35 to 40 minutes. And this is what we have. And I'm going to check the temperature, and I'm sorry I've got the wrong thermometer here. It's not an instant read, but it'll work. You want enriched breads to cook up to between 195 and 200 degrees, and enriched is any bread that's got eggs or milk in it. And this is right at 200. And I'm going to flip this out on a rack. And you know, it would also, if you thump it, it would sound hollow, but I just don't trust that. I always use a thermometer because I don't want it to be gummy inside. And if you use a thermometer, you'll always be sure. If it hadn't been done, I would have put it back in the oven for 5 more minutes. While it's good and hot, I'm going to brush it with some melted butter. If you want a firmer crust, a crunchier crust, don't do this. Then we're going to let it cool for a full hour before we cut it. And let me explain why I call this sandwich bread. Sandwich bread has a firmer texture to hold up to the sandwich, a finer grain. And after an hour, I'm going to show you what I mean by that firmer, finer grain. Let me slice a chunk of this here. And it would hold up, because it's firm, it would hold up to a thinner slice. But I want to cut this just to show you what we've got here. Now, you can faintly see the circular swirl in the grain from the way we folded it. It stands up, no big holes. I've buttered a little piece here because I can't help myself, and I'm going to have a bite. And I'll show you the texture from where I have bitten into it. You see it's firm. It's going to hold up and make a really great sandwich, or toast, or French toast, or whatever you want to do with fresh bread. Just eat it with butter. See that wonderful grain in there. I love this bread. I hope you do too. Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. Hope you make this, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.